Without further ado then, I'm going to invite Mr. Blair onto the stage so we can kick off this third annual conference. Mr. Blair. To the far side. No one left after I spoke, did they? So, thank you, firstly, for making the time to do this. And let's just kick off sort of briefly. The Prime Minister has made it clear she thinks Britain is going to leave the European Union this day next year. And actually, there was a story in the FT today saying it might even be earlier, which took me by surprise. What's your alternative vision for how this next year might pan out?
That we don't leave. That we have a vote in Parliament on the deal that she negotiates and brings forward to Parliament. That the vote in Parliament results in a defeat for the proposition for our future relationship in Europe, and that the people then have a vote on whether the deal they're being offered for the future is better than what they have now.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. What I want to do briefly is circle back in time a little bit to the time when you were Prime Minister and ask you a couple of things about that. Starting with, when you were Prime Minister with that humongous majority in the early days, do you think you did enough to sell Europe to the British people?
Well, I did a lot of trying, let's say, and it's not always easy because there's obviously a significant part of British opinion that's Eurosceptic. But we were leaders in Europe during our time at the time as Prime Minister in Europe, and we had a very strong position in Europe. And I suppose, yes, you can always say you can do more to sell it, but at the time it looked as if I was pretty much an outlier in terms of pro-European sentiment. And I think we've still got the same debate today, which is around what is the true national interest. Is Europe an interference with our sovereignty, or is Europe in a modern 21st century, in a changing world, is membership of the European Union a way of enhancing our sovereignty because it allows us to gain collective strength in a changing world? And, the thing that I think is the missing dimension, because everything's focused at the moment on trade, single market, Northern Ireland, what are the terms of withdrawal? The single biggest thing, I think, for the country to keep in mind is that the geopolitics of the 21st century are undergoing a profound revolution. Mm-hmm. I mean, in time to come, we are going to be a medium-sized country in a world of tall countries and three giants, right? The three giants are going to be America, China, and India. There are going to be other countries as GDP and population become realigned through the mobility of technology and capital, and this is what is happening. You're going to find even a country like Indonesia, which has got a population of 3 or 4 times that of Germany, is going to become a bigger and bigger economy, bigger size, more power. But the dominance of China is going to be the single biggest geopolitical factor of the 21st century. And the case for Europe today and the case for Britain to be part of Europe is not the case that was made for my father's generation, which was about peace after the Second World War. Today, the case is about power. It's just a simple equation. If you want to have the power to represent your interests and have influence in the world, if you are a medium-sized player, you've got to band together with others. Mm. And this is why what's happening around the world, by the way, as China rises, is that people are forming these regional blocs. So, in the end, that's the case for Britain to be part of Europe. It's not about peace today, it's about power. And it's about not confusing patriotism with a delusion about the way the 21st century is going to be for us. So we can be a really powerful, important global player, but not without alliances. And to give up this huge alliance right on our doorstep, to which we're joined physically by the Channel Tunnel, geographically, historically, culturally, to absent ourselves from the biggest of our markets and the largest political union in the world is an extraordinary, self-defeating act if you want this country to remain strong. And one of the things I find most bizarre when you really dig down and you try and ask the people who are want Britain to leave Europe, when you actually ask them, what is it that you want? I mean, if you want to be global Britain, which is what Theresa May says, and I heard Liam Fox say the same this morning, how do you start by being global Britain, by withdrawing from the biggest global alliance in trade right on your doorstep? It's an extraordinary thing to contemplate, in my view. Anyway, so that's why I think this argument isn't done until it's done, and then let's see what happens in the next year.
But isn't one of the reasons why people want to withdraw from global trade, insofar as they do, precisely because successive governments, including your own, have accepted free movement, which in some parts of the country is very, very unpopular. And I notice your own institute today has come out with a list of ways in which you could limit this. Do you regret not doing that, is probably the first question. And secondly, the gains of globalisation weren't fairly enough divided out. So the theoretical argument that trade is good in the aggregate didn't cut through to the people who weren't feeling the benefit.
Right, I mean, let me just come back to the immigration thing in a moment, but here's what I find really curious. I completely understand that argument. So if Theresa May was going to kick off her tour today and say, you know what, globalisation, I think it's got many problems and we're not so much in favour of it, really. And therefore we're going to have to restrict a lot of the free trade. But she's not. She's saying precisely the opposite. She's saying, no, we want Britain out of Europe. We want it to become this great global trading nation. That's what's weird. So I understand the argument. I don't agree with it, that globalization is a destructive force, that it's gone too far, it's got to be controlled. But that's not the argument they're making. They're actually and this is, by the way, where the real disillusion's going to come with Brexit, because the base support that voted leave is anti-globalization, right? And it's particularly anti-immigration. So if you end up getting out of Europe and then pursuing these great free trade agreements, I mean, leave aside the workability of all that. But let's supposing you do with America and China and India, and I mean, what do we think the Chinese and the Indians are going to say? Sure, just come into our markets. No, they're going to be driving a very hard deal to get into our markets. So, if you want globalization, okay, fine, but it's a strange thing to start by getting out of Europe. But if you're trying to obey the will of the people in that sense, I would agree with you. I would say a large part of that sentiment on leave was anti-globalization. Now, just to deal with 2004 and migration, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. I mean, look, the politics of 2018, frankly, aren't the politics of 2004. And, you're in a completely different context today. But it's just worth pointing out in 2004, those countries came in from Eastern Europe and joined the European Union. And by the way, given what is happening with Russia today, thank goodness we did enlarge the European Union and brought those countries in. We would be in a much less secure position in Europe today if we hadn't. But the moment they joined, and this is the misunderstanding, they had freedom of movement. There was no transition for freedom of movement. What countries were able to do is impose transitional controls on the freedom to work. But the risk was our economy at the time was very, very strong. We actually, frankly, had a requirement for European migrant labour. Germany did introduce transitional controls. They still got large numbers of people coming, and a lot of them then ended up working anyway without the proper permissions. So, you can debate this, but in any event, the transition would have come to an end in 2011, and, frankly, we are where we are with it. The interesting thing is that if you wanted to prioritize controlling immigration over freedom of movement, then even within the existing freedom of movement principle of the European Union, you could make big changes if you wanted to. I mean, the fact is governments of both stripes didn't want to, because frankly, I think one of the things that's so sad about this situation is I actually think European migration has been on the whole a good thing for this country, not a bad thing. I think there have been people of real ability and talent and, vitality that have come into our country and made it stronger and not weaker. But if you wanted to prioritize the control of migration, you could do what the French do or what the Belgians do.
But you understand why the people, say, of South Lincolnshire, who might live in towns where the population trebles over summer, where it's impossible to go and see a GP during those months, might have a slightly different view.
Yeah, exactly. And so the question is, how would you deal with that? And is there a way, this was the whole debate about emergency brakes and so on, which is something David Cameron didn't secure, but I think, frankly, if there was a negotiation that was part of Britain staying, then I think we probably could secure it. And we could be supporting within Europe, as President Macron has set out, for example, the Posted Workers Directive, which would prevent you undercutting local wages. And, you know, if you look at what, for example, the Belgians do, you come into Belgium as a European migrant. If within 2 months you've not found work and can't support yourself, they put you out again. So I'm not necessarily advocating any of this. I'm just saying, you know, if you want to deal with immigration, there are ways of dealing with it. But number one, we can deal with much European migration within the existing rules. And number two, if you want to deal with non-EU migration, which, by the way, I think is the bigger anxiety that people have, then, you know, the Institute report we published today sets out how you can have an entirely new system of migration. You can have electronic identity for people, you know, which is something you can do today with the technology, much, much easier than you could have 12 years ago when we were debating identity cards, and where actually most of Europe will move in that direction now. And that will allow you, for example, if you have electronic identity, it will allow you to say who's got a right to be here and who hasn't, which I think is the single biggest anxiety people have about immigration.
I must say, I do look forward to David Davis having to introduce identity cards in order to control the new migration system they bring in. But
yeah, I agree. But, you know, in that case, don't go on about immigration. What I worry about is these guys want to exploit the immigration issue and not actually deal with it.
So let's go to the present. You talked about Parliament having a vote, this being a meaningful vote and Parliament being able to exercise its power. If Parliament gets a vote, and let's face it, it won't be on a trade deal, it'll be on a set of aspirations, because that's all we're going to get by the end of this year. How meaningful is that vote going to be? Because it'll be so close to the end of the Article 50 process anyway.
Right, well, that's a really good question. But the premise of your question is the fear that I have and the thing we've got to avoid. On Monday, Theresa May said in the House of Commons that she gave a very important commitment. Very important commitment. She said there would be sufficient detail given about the new relationship with Europe, not just about the withdrawal agreement, but the new relationship, that the vote would be meaningful because it would not be vague or aspirational, but it would be definitive. Now, I think that is the critical question. And I think Parliament, first of all, has got a responsibility to hold her to that. And so we should know what the New Deal actually looks like. And then secondly, then you'll have a vote on it. Now, you know, the fact is, and look, she may be able to square the circle and resolve what I call the dilemma with the capital D. What's the dilemma? The dilemma is, and this is where Northern Ireland is a metaphor for the whole negotiation. Right? The dilemma is this. If you want frictionless trade, you're going to have to align yourself with European rules. If you align yourself with European rules, then either in several sectors or in the whole of your trade, then the country's going to say, well, what's the point of leaving? I mean, we've just become rule takers and not rule makers. Okay. If, on the other hand, you say, I want freedom to diverge so that your rules are different from those of Europe, then you're going to have real friction in the trade. That is the dilemma. Now, what the Prime Minister, David Davis, Liam Fox, and all these people have set up to now is that they can resolve that dilemma. But if you look carefully at what they say is, yes, we want, as near as damn it, the trade we have now, but with the freedom to diverge from Europe's rules. That is merely to express the dilemma. It's not to resolve it. It's as you say, it's a vague aspiration. The fact is, that's what we now know in the you know, this is now known as cakeism, right? This is, you know, you can have your cake and eat it. Europe's not going to agree this. Okay, so at some point in the next few months, maybe around June, maybe it won't be till October, at some point it's going to become clear that cakeism isn't on the agenda, it's not on the menu, right? And at that point, that's when the thing gets really difficult, and that's the thing that changes the whole nature of the debate. Because if you resolve the dilemma in favour of staying close to Europe, you're going to disappoint the Brexit people. If you go to the other side and end up with a clean break, so that you end up with a Canada-style free trade agreement with whatever plus you can get in it, I think, frankly, it's going to be limited, then, frankly, you're going to do significant economic damage, and business is going to be saying that. So that the government strategy up to now has been not to resolve that dilemma by kicking it down the road. But at a certain point, if she means what she says about you will have sufficient detail to know the new relationship, then they're going to have to resolve it. And the moment that happens, that's the missing fact from the debate. The moment that happens, you're able to see what Brexit really means. Because there are different versions of Brexit, as we know.
OK, so moving from the substance of putative sort of political agreement on trade, and I have to say my ambition for the second half of the Article 50 process is we move away from food analogies and find different ones. But onto the politics of this. Why in the world would Conservative MPs, however attached they are to the European Union, vote in such a way as to make a Corbyn government more likely?
Well, I think if they go through, leave aside the wisdom or otherwise of a Corbyn government for the moment.
I wasn't trying to draw you on that. No,
exactly, no, and I let's say I won't be drawn on that today, at least. So if you, I think, this is a very good question. I think the Conservatives have got to understand that if they drive through this Brexit deal, that is going to be the gateway to a Corbyn government, because in my view, Brexit will then be 100% owned by the Tories. Right? It's a 100% fully owned project of the Tories. I don't believe that Labour will vote for the Tory deal on Brexit. And it will allow Labour to say, well, we'd have got you a better deal, and these guys didn't get the right deal, and so on. And by the time you get to 2022, you'll be out of the European Union. People will then, I've got a feeling the 17 million who voted to leave are going to be short on gratitude, and the 60 million who voted to remain are going to be long on memory.
Well, let me challenge you on that, though. And isn't it more immediate than that? So imagine the scenario. You're a Conservative backbencher. You go into the lobbies on the day that whatever the Prime Minister has is being voted on. It seems to me that there is no way the Prime Minister can survive losing that vote. I mean, she's staked her reputation on doing Brexit. If Parliament votes that deal down, I don't see how she remains. But just bear with me. Let's assume she resigns. Then if you're a moderate Tory Remainer, you're thinking, if I vote this down, my choice is essentially going to be Jacob Rees-Mogg or Jeremy Corbyn, because we're going to get a new leader in the Conservative Party, because there's going to be a leadership election. And if worse comes to worse, there'll be an election and we'll lose it. Why would you go there?
Right, so here's the thing, which I think is important just to work through. So if you're a Tory MP, let's say you get the deal, and let's say you actually don't think it's that good a deal, right? And it's not a good deal either because what's the point of leaving, because we're still having to align with Europe, or it's not a good deal because it's actually going to do a lot of damage economically and business and industry, and people will be saying that. So if you're a Tory MP, you could say, I don't think this is a good deal. I'm not going to vote for this deal. If it's then defeated in the House of Commons, she doesn't need to resign, and there doesn't need to be an election. She can simply say, OK, I put the deal before Parliament, they rejected it. Now it's right that the people have the vote. They should have the final say. It's actually perfectly rational. It's to say the country took a decision to leave the European Union. The government was mandated to negotiate the deal. It's now negotiated the deal. Now let's decide whether we like the deal or not. In fact, if it wasn't for the way this whole thing has gone and for the way that what I call that sort of right-wing media cartel just keep this constant barrage of propaganda, it would be common sense to say, let's wait until we see the terms of the new relationship before irrevocably we get out of the old one. It's only in the bizarre world that's been created that we think this is a betrayal of the British people. I mean, look, as I've said before, it's like agreeing a house swap, right? You agree to swap your house. You say, yep, I definitely want to swap the house. No one would go through with that until they'd seen the other property. I mean, you wouldn't, would you? You'd want to see, you want to get the survey done, you want to visit the neighbourhood, you want to see what the house is like, whether you really wanted to move. All people like me are saying is not that we can just go and reverse the 2016 vote or rerun the referendum. What we should do is wait until they have negotiated the deal. Then make a decision, okay, we now know what the other house looks like. Do we really want to move there or not? I don't think it's very complicated. And I think for the Conservatives, here's the benefit, if the Conservatives were thinking strategically. What's their biggest risk? Their biggest risk is that they repeat the problem they had in the election last year. What was the problem? The problem was that they were asking for a mandate for Brexit at any cost, and the public said no. Right? Now, when they get to the election in 2022, if they've still got Brexit round their neck as the millstone, they're in danger of going down because, as I say, the people who voted Remain are going to think, you guys have delivered us this, and it's not really delivered what you told us it would, because, frankly, the facts just won't meet the claims they're making for it at the moment. And that's their biggest risk. Whereas if they've said, look, we did our best, we put it to Parliament, Parliament voted it down, we put it back to the people decided. If the people decide to stay, that's fine. If the people decide to leave, that's an end of the matter. But when the Tories go in 2022, they're not responsible. The people have taken the decision.
OK, I mean, I slightly take issue with your interpretation of the general election because it rather begs the question as to why no one voted for the Lib Dems. I mean,
I'm not sure.
When I say I don't mean no one.
No, I'm actually not sure. Let me just answer that as a sort of, as what used to be a practicing politician, as it were. I think people were completely irrational. They knew a vote for the Lib Dems wasn't going to cut the Tory majority. They knew a vote for Labour would.
OK. Do you think it would be legitimate for Parliament to overturn the referendum?
I think it's very difficult for this to be done without first a vote in Parliament to defeat the government's deal and then going back to the people. OK,
so let's imagine we're in a world where this is happening. So the first question I've got for you, I suppose, is what would that referendum question be? Because, of course, there are several ways of formulating it. And Lord Ashcroft, I don't know if you saw, did some polling on this and put different sorts of referendum questions. The only one for which there was popular support was a choice between leaving with the deal or leaving with no deal at all. So Remain wasn't one of the options. So what would the choice be?
I think that's, again, it's a very good question. I think as the debate develops and you actually see the deal, you'll have a clearer idea of what it is. But I think the sensible thing would be, because you could say the government's then got to go back and renegotiate it. But I just don't think that's realistic. If you've managed to get all 27 European governments and parliaments and the European Parliament behind it, it strikes me as unlikely you can renegotiate it. I mean, I think the question would have to be whether you prefer this deal to staying. But, you can debate that, what the right question should be. The important thing is the first point is a point of principle. It is the mandate of June 2016 a mandate where we say we are definitively reading the mind of the British people in this 52-48 situation, as meaning that we leave whatever the deal, whatever the terms, or even if no terms. Now, it's an extraordinary thing to me that both main political parties say, yep, that's what they said. I don't know how they work that out, but anyway, that's what they're saying. But I think when members of Parliament really look at this, and when you have a specific deal on the table so that you know what you're comparing to membership of the European Union, I think people are going to say, well, you know what? Brexit means very many different things. Look, I think the thing that most people think about Brexit, if they, were uncertain what to do, and I think you can say this about soft leavers or soft remainers, I think the one thing people do think is this has turned out a darn sight more complicated than we thought. That, I think, people are already at.
But shouldn't people who think we should just leave without a deal at all have an option on the ballot for?
Yeah, well, you can argue that. And one of the things that's very strange is that people, when I first made this suggestion, they said, Well, you might have to have options. You know, as if the British people were incapable of working that one out. I mean, look, you either decide you're going to do this by popular vote or you don't. We've decided we're going to determine our future in Europe by popular vote. So I think, you know, I'm not taking a definitive position on that at the moment. I think you have to wait and see how it develops. All I'm saying is that I think the two questions are, one, when the deal comes before Parliament, what is Parliament going to do? And secondly, I don't think if the government's defeated, it has to have an election. It really doesn't. And neither do I think that she's in a position where she has to resign. She's perfectly entitled to say, look, I did my best and here it is, and now it's back for the people to vote.
I've got to go backwards, actually, and interject something. Do you feel at all guilty for making referendums acceptable as a tool of constitutional decision-making?
Well, I think, let's say, every situation on its own merits. Look, if the Lisbon Treaty had come about, if the French and Dutch hadn't voted it down, we would have had a referendum on that. I think if you're going to change radically the relationship, the constitutional relationship in a country, there's a case for having a referendum, which is why we did it on devolution. And I don't think, for example, we would have ever got the Good Friday Agreement through if we hadn't had a referendum at the end of it. But would I have held a referendum on European Union membership, sort of not apropos of a proposition from Europe, but just generally? No, I think I was the one person in the 2015 election who made a speech about Europe, which shows you in this strange way. I mean, it's very odd to think, if you look back on the 2015 election, Europe basically didn't really feature, not much. And yet, you know, after the referendum, of course, it becomes the dominant question, because it becomes the receptacle for all these other anxieties.
But then I should add that in the 2017 election, immigration barely featured because we'd left the European Union. I mean, these things change as a result.
Yeah, but, you know, I do think with immigration, because I do, you know, I handled this a lot in government. I mean, the first pieces of legislation I put through where there were big rebellions and controversies was around asylum, tightening asylum laws and so on. I mean, I think this has been building for a long time. And I also think this is where, by the way, Europe, if it's sensible, and Britain does give an indication it may change its mind, you know, I think Europe, and I said this in a speech in Brussels a few weeks back, would be well advised to realise that the anxieties of Britain weren't confined to Britain. I mean, if you look at the Italian election, immigration was the single biggest issue in that election too.
What evidence do you have that Britain might be changing its mind? I mean, I suppose the bigger question is, what makes you think a second referendum could be won? The opinion polls look pretty similar to what they did before. I saw a poll a couple of weeks ago that suggested if we did it again, Leave would win by 1%. Why do you think people would change?
I don't. For me to argue that we should have a final vote on the deal, it's not necessary for me to argue we have to win. It's a matter of principle that the people should have that decision. Look, my instinct is that there is some movement, but I don't think that this is going to be, you know, we're not going to be able to really evaluate that until you see the deal. Because at the moment, I think what a lot of people think is, you know, and I hear this, people often say this to me, they say, oh, look, you know, come on, it's done now, it's going to happen. And you say, well, it's very difficult. What deal will they get? And they say, well, look, you know, the politicians, they'll shout and bawl at each other, but in the end, they'll come to a deal. And I think when the transitional arrangement thing happened last week or the week before, I think people felt, you know, that shows you they'll come to an arrangement in the end. The key about those transitional arrangements is that we basically caved in and we postponed the difficult question, right? So we didn't really negotiate that difficult point. Now, my point is, when the public actually understands that there is no easy way, that we're going to retain all our trading links with Europe, but be free to go our own way where we want to, then I think that's the point at which it will be interesting to test where the public opinion is moving. Because as I say, I think the deal will either offend some of the Brexit people, or it's going to leave some of those that voted Leave in a state of anxiety about the economic impact.
So just and I'm asking you to imagine a lot of things today, like being a Tory MP and all sorts of things, but just imagine one more thing. Imagine we're in a world where we've had this next referendum and we vote to remain by, let's say, 52 to 48. Wouldn't that be the mother of all nightmares for the politics of this country? Well,
that's why I think you've... I mean, first of all, if the people decide it, they decided, okay. I think, you see, I've said there are kind of three stools to this, three legs to this stool, rather. You've got persuading British public opinion that the deal is not a good deal and it's not better than the existing relationship. Then you've got ensuring that Europe, if we do look like we're changing our mind, is prepared also to agree certain changes and reforms. And then the third element, which is why we've done the paper today on immigration, is to say there are different and better ways of dealing with the anxieties people have. And so you need all three. And I think this latter one, this is what I think is missing from British politics at the moment. You know, you do have to deal with the fallout from globalization, communities and people feeling left behind. You do have to deal with these anxieties over immigration. And the irony of the present situation is that Brexit will make all of those things worse. If you look at the studies that have been done on the impact regionally, you break it down region by region of Brexit, the communities that are going to suffer worst. I mean, I think your own report was showing
UK and the Changing Europe research, absolutely.
Right.
Say it again.
Yeah, it's a wonderful piece of research. You know, that shows you that those communities are going to lose most. And by the way, that to me is going to be the big disillusion. Just think a few years ahead. You know, this is what I always say to people about politics. There's tactics and strategy. Tactics are the politics of the moment. Strategy is leaping over the moment and imagining the long term. Imagine the long term in which people have been promised, we do Brexit, there's the brave new world out there and it's going to be great and your communities are going to do really well and you're going to do really well and all these problems that you used to have are going to be taken care of. Imagine 5 years' time and those communities will have less money to spend on them. They will be the ones that will suffer most economically from Brexit. And when we talk about control over our laws, you know, one of the things I say to the Brexit people is, look, I was Prime Minister for 10 years. Okay, I can't remember a single law I thought I really got to pass in Britain, but I can't because Europe's stopping me. Or one that Europe made me pass. And, by the way, I look back over the last 7 years of Queen's speeches and budget and financial statements, with the exception of a few things around VAT, not once does the Prime Minister or the Chancellor get up and say, you know what, we do have this amazing new future, but we can't get there because Europe's stopping us.
But let me just come back on this. I mean, firstly, the thing under your scenario is that pain won't have materialised. Okay, we have a second referendum, so we haven't left the single market and the customs union. The economic impact of Brexit won't have been felt. So they're still taking it on faith, and the referendum suggests that they don't believe people who say it's going to be bad. Won't they just feel, won't the British electorate, those who voted leave, just feel betrayed? And, you know, with all due respect, if a combination of you, George Osborne and Nick Clegg stand up and say, look, we understand now that there were grievances, we'll fix them in the future, honest.
Yeah, yeah, but, you know, I mean, first of all, just to go back a bit into my government, we actually did put a huge amount of investment in these communities. And, you know, the history of that shouldn't be rewritten on the left any more than the history of it on immigration should be rewritten
I agree,
from
absolutely.
the right. But, you know, the question is, if you go ahead with this, I mean, this is why it's very difficult, because the fact is the country is deeply divided. So I'm kind of looking for ways in which you resolve that division. But also let's think of this. The years ahead, with a younger generation of people, because let's be clear, if you look at the facts, I mean, it's a staggering generational divide. I mean, it really is. And, you know, a lot of young people, okay, maybe they don't have as loud voices today in this debate, but they feel really, really betrayed in their future. And they want to be, you know, partly because they can see the way the world is changing and shifting. So you've also got to take into account them as well. So look, it is a very difficult question because it goes to the heart of what we are as a country. You know, this is why it is such a divisive issue. And look, I can't say to you that those divisions would be healed in the way I describe. I'm simply saying I think you've got a better chance of healing some of them. But I think if you turn the thing around the other way and we do this and we leave, I think there's also going to be a real sense of betrayal and anxiety, because, you know, there's a lot of people out there who are going to feel their future has been undermined. Look, this is only anecdotal, but I worry about the to find the right way of describing it, almost the kind of spirit that we have given off since Brexit. You know, what people think about Britain. And, you know, one of the things you do as a former Prime Minister, obviously, you visit different parts of the world, you see different people. It doesn't matter where you go in the world. I'm not saying, if we end up leaving, I will end up saying, okay, we're now going to make the best of a new future, and we've all got to pull together and try and do that. And I think it will require a lot of adjustments politically, socially, economically, but we'll have to do it. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. The rest of the world do not see this as globally ambitious Britain. I mean, they really don't. They think, Lord, the Brits, you guys were always really common sense people. I mean, that's what they think. Now, they may all be wrong, and and if we leave, we'll have to prove them wrong. But they do not. There is a really quite fundamental mismatch between the rhetoric the Prime Minister and other ministers are using around this and how the rest of the world sees it, because they don't, you know, if you're in China, do you think it's sensible for Britain to leave the European Union? If you're the US, okay, leave aside. But the fact of the matter is, and this is one of the other reasons why, you know, you talk to most American opinion formers and policymakers, they recognize that Britain inside Europe is a great, you know, pillar of strength in the transatlantic alliance. You pull Britain out of Europe, inevitably you're going to have less influence with European countries, and therefore that transatlantic alliance is weakened. So wherever you go in the world, I mean, you know, this is the problem that we're going to face, and I think. So what I'm really saying is, it's such a momentous decision. Let's reconsider when we see the deal. If we go ahead and we leave, as I say, then for me that's over. I mean, you'll hear, you know, no more about changing the decision. If you get past March 2019 and we leave, we're going to have to make the best of a new future. But we shouldn't take that decision irrevocably until we know what we're getting.
Much to my horror, we've reached the end of our time. Can I just say a couple of things to the audience before? We've got 2 keynotes today, and for both of them, if you could just keep your seats afterwards, because we're going to go straight through to the next panel when we've finished. I should also make it clear, Mr. Blair was very keen to take questions from the audience, and I said he couldn't. But partly because of all the faffing around with roving mics, which is just annoying, and partly because I've wanted to do this for ages, and I've got about 10 pages of questions I haven't asked, so it's kind of self-indulgent on my part. It remains for me simply to say, Mr. Blair, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It's been really, really interesting, and I've enjoyed it tremendously.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.